Nearly 6 years ago, I started a small, simple habit that would go on to transform my life. I opened up a notebook and wrote down 5 things I was grateful for. But instead of unemotionally listing these down, I intuitively practiced something called mental subtraction, where I imagined the absence of this positive experience or act or thing that I was writing down. And I imagined what it might have been like if these positive things wouldn't have happened. I believe the combination of writing down my gratitude list alongside mental subtraction increased the potency of the practice and expanded my sense of appreciation. I then did it for the next 2000 plus days, which is what this video is all about. If you're in a rush, I've already given you the answer. But if you have a bit of time today, I invite you to stay with me in this video and delve a little bit deeper into really practical things so that you can perhaps cultivate this in your own life. I'm aware that many popular podcasters have commented on gratitude practice, and there is a vast body of academic literature, scientific literature on this practice. But what you're going to find from this video is perhaps what you might not find from any other source. First of all, I've practiced this for 5+ years, as I mentioned, 2000 plus days. And as far as I'm aware, no one else has reported in this fashion before. And secondly, even in the scientific studies, the reporting is for very short-term studies, 10 weeks or so, as far as I'm aware. And they're done in very clinical, sort of methodical settings, which of course is great for science and empirical study, but perhaps not so applicable when we're trying to translate that into our own lives with all the nuances and complexities that we face on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to delve into some practical tips and share my experience with you in the hopes that you would be able to use this to cultivate your own gratitude practice. Before I begin, I also want to delve into something that Andrew Huberman, who has a very popular video on this topic, Andrew mentions that listing gratitude or the counting your blessings practice is a less effective way than, say, receiving gratitude or perceiving gratitude as an emotion through stories, through evocative stories. Now, I see his point. I understand that these kinds of stimuli might help create more concrete changes in our brains and our neural circuits. However, I don't think it is practically applicable or very feasible when we're trying to adopt this as a day-to-day practice. The reason I say this is because receiving gratitude is stochastic. We might not always be thanked for something good that we do. Equally, we might not always find someone else's story very evocative. Yes, of course, there are stories such as Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, even Edith Eger's The Choice, or Anthony Ray Hinton's The Sun Does Shine, all of which I've referenced in my videos before. So these stories might evoke that emotion within us, but if we are trying to cultivate a regular practice, then it's not always feasible for us to go and hunt for these stories, which we might not find. The best story, in my view, is our own life. So how can we best utilize that to live an even better life? That's what I'm interested in. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what prompted me to start. One of my favorite books is called The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Deutsch. It's a wonderful book on the studies of neuroplasticity and the wonders of our brain, essentially. Now, neuroplasticity makes our brains very resourceful, but paradoxically, as Norman Deutsch puts it can also make our brains very rigid and quite like the substance plastic. It means that we might unconsciously or consciously adopt practices that are unhelpful, which later then become very hard to change. Now, the wonder of neuroplasticity means that it is, of course, possible to change these things, though it might require a lot of effort on our parts. I believe negativity bias is one of those things. You might have heard of this term. It's quite popular now, I think, and gets spoken about a lot. Negativity bias is when our brains, and naturally as humans, we are more receptive to negative experiences and stimuli coming from our environment, and even in our thoughts, more so than positive ones. If we think about our human evolution, of course, this makes sense. Our ancestors had to ensure to stay safe from threats such as wild animals and make sure that we were not being mauled to ensure our survival. However, in the modern day, much of these threats are no longer that. We live in relatively much more comfortable standards compared to those of our ancestors. So the negativity bias can be more unhelpful than helpful in our modern day. I'm someone who isn't naturally oriented towards the positive. I don't think I'm someone who's naturally oriented towards being grateful or experiencing gratitude. So this is a practice that has very much helped me orient my mind towards that. When I first started, it did feel slightly weird. I remember the circumstances around it. I wasn't particularly in a good place. I was finishing up my final year of undergrad in the UK, and it was a difficult time because I was simultaneously trying to make ends meet, working alongside very demanding coursework and assignments and exams and so forth. And I remember this urge to shift my mindset, to do something, to shift my mindset away from constantly feeling like the underdog, constantly feeling like I'm fighting against the grain, to trying to recognize all the good that I have in my life. What exactly prompted this is hazy for me, but I think that mindset shift was a big driver personally. So, as I mentioned, first starting journaling, gratitude journaling, was weird because I had to really pay attention to my surroundings. And what was interesting was this intuitive mental subtraction that I did. I didn't have a whole lot, so I looked around and found what I did have. For example, a warm bed, a roof over my head. Pretty basic things, but because I mentally subtracted, I was very grateful for not being out in the cold, in the UK winter, which can be very harsh and dark, of having food in my belly, of having that warmth, that essential shelter that allowed me to start this practice. Now, for the first couple of days, it was a bit weird, but what was beautiful was that I noticed that moments of gratitude started trickling out of the conscious sitting down and writing about it to moments, the present moments throughout the day. So, for example, if I went out for a walk, I would suddenly notice that beautiful flower that was blooming and the vibrancy of it would captivate me. And I would feel grateful for it in the moment itself. And I'd make a mental note to write about it later on at night when I wrote in the journal. I now say that this gratitude practice is one of collecting morsels of positive experiences throughout the day to journal about, personally for me, at night. So gratitude has very much become an anchor because it helps me tap into and recognize those positive sensory experiences that I might not otherwise have had. And in turn, these positive sensory experiences tend to disrupt the negative thought cycles I might otherwise find myself trapped in. So in that way, it has very much become an antidote to negativity. When I first started, now I want to talk a little bit about some of the practical tips to get started. I think it's important to start small and show up even when it's tough. And as I mentioned, I didn't start this when I was happy. I started this when I was in quite a dark place. If you are really struggling to find 5 things to be grateful for, try to think of one thing. Focus on just one thing you might be grateful for, and use mental subtraction to notice what's around you and deduct that from your life and see if you'd really feel the impact of that deduction or that absence. It might be something really small, like a pleasant interaction that you had with some person that you might not have otherwise had, that added richness to your life. It can be small cumulative moments that then tend to add up towards gratitude as a trait, as a more permanent, permeating sense in our lives. I think it's important to pay close attention to what we are doing, the present moment and our surroundings. And this noticing has a symbiotic relationship with our gratitude practice. I'm sure you've noticed this already from what I've already shared. Noticing helps create plastic change in our brains, and the gratitude practice has really helped me cultivate this. I also recommend pairing this with other positive, healthy practices such as meditation, yoga, and whatever that you find comfort and grounding in. Now, if you notice that you are really struggling, then that is a good indicator that some inner work, some healing needs to happen before perhaps your heart opens up to this emotion. I recommend that you speak to somebody safe and supportive that can help you through this journey, that would help you uncover some of the inner healing or trauma that you need to work on, and then be able to open yourself up towards this emotion. Don't be hard on yourself if you can't experience this in the first instance. In my own practice, going back to my own practice, I learned a pretty big lesson early on in my practice, about a year in actually. And I'm going to offer this to you. Don't be grateful for a future that is not guaranteed. Tomorrow is not guaranteed. And Lady Fortune, if you've read The Consolations of Philosophy by Boethius, you know who Lady Fortune is. She pretty brutally taught this lesson to me. One day I wrote in my gratitude journal that I was grateful for a bright tomorrow. And the next day, my mother passed away. I've already spoken about my mother's loss in a past video, and it was one of the most important lessons that I've learned, because being grateful for a tomorrow today might result in great pain, great disappointment, and ultimately a very strong reminder that you are not guaranteed it as you expect it. So ultimately, I think my gratitude practice did help me process some of the difficult emotions, especially the grief that was arising. Of course, I had to pair this with many other outlets, positive outlets and healthy practices. This is not something I think you can use alone, the practice itself. It needs to be paired with others to help process something as deep as grief and trauma. But on the whole, the practice helped me tap back into more positive emotions and helped me reframe some of the experiences that I had in that time, especially regrets, in a more constructive, more life-affirming sort of way. How do we build gratitude as a habit or daily practice? Here are a few tips I could offer you. I first started by setting reminders on my phone, and I linked it to an existing habit. So at night I would brush my teeth, and then the reminder on my phone would go off to make sure that I would write down in my journal. And I used the reminders on my phone for a few weeks, for as long as I needed. And then I realized, actually, I don't need this anymore. It's been very much ingrained as a habit now. So I encourage you to try that out and use the technology that we have in a positive way. And I encourage you to also pick whatever format that works for you, whether that's digital, old-fashioned pen and paper. I like my notebooks and pens. I love carrying them around when I travel. They always come with me. And in terms of duration, I practice for no more than 5 to 10 minutes every day, writing down in my gratitude journal. But as I've said, this emotion permeates out of the actual journaling practice to many moments throughout the day for me now. I think the duration is minute detail. It really doesn't matter, and there's no consensus in the scientific literature for how long, how long each day or each time you practice gratitude you need to spend time on. And equally, the ideal frequency is not agreed in literature either. I don't think it really matters. What matters in this instance is finding something that works for us. For me, a daily habit has very much become a part of my life. It's not a chore to me. And I make sure that I bring meaning to the practice by doing things like mental subtraction. I also want to highlight the fact that it's important not to censor ourselves when we are doing this journaling. Let it come out in a narrative way, if possible, where possible. Elaborate on those details that you found compelling or that particularly resonated with you. There's no need to edit grammar or anything like that. It's unlikely that anyone else would read these journals. Perhaps like me, in a few years' time, you might flick back on a few of those old gratitude journals and find out what you were up to, and it's wonderful to do that. I love doing that. But other than that, there's absolutely no need to censor ourselves. It's very much part of our growth as human beings. I think it's great to also expand the practice as we practice the journaling itself. One way that I have expanded my practice is by writing gratitude letters. I keep a set of postcards, and whenever I feel compelled to do so, whenever I feel genuinely grateful towards someone, I write it down, and I love giving it to them. Now, in the scientific literature, it says it doesn't really matter whether you give it to the other person or not. I personally like giving it to them because I love the concept of reciprocity, where we are positively influencing our own neural circuitry as well as another's by expressing our gratitude, and the recipient would in turn be positively affected by our gratitude. I want to end by stressing that a gratitude practice is by no means a panacea. It is not going to magically erase the negative emotions that we face, but I think it can help reduce the intensity of some of those. It doesn't erase the need to do inner work, to heal ourselves from any past trouble or trauma. I think it's important that we sit with those and work through them. But as I have shared, and hopefully as I have evidence through my own story, gratitude helps reduce the time that those negative emotions linger. It helps us reframe them from time to time, and it helps disrupt some of those negative thought cycles with those positive sensory experiences. So I do think that gratitude is very much an antidote to negativity. I can speak so much more on this topic of gratitude, but I better stop here. And this video would be very long otherwise. If you've reached this point of this video with me, I want to express a very heartfelt thank you.